Forest Mysteries.
Eamon Keegan stepped onto the porch just as the first gray light bled through the pines. The morning had a raw, damp smell, wet needles and cold earth. He pulled the collar of his flannel shirt tighter and filled his lungs with air that tasted like iron and moss. 74 years had left their mark in the stiffness of his fingers and the deep ache in his hips, but habit pushed him forward. The coffee in his metal cup steamed once, then surrendered to the cold. He walked to the edge of the clearing and set the cup on the old stump he used as a table. The plastic bucket waited beneath a piece of oilcloth, frozen scraps of venison and dry kibble. No matter the season, the ritual held. It had held for 6 years, ever since the winter he found the half-dead wolf pup tangled in the rusted trap line near Fox Creek. Gray, he had named him. Not after the color, though his coat was the shade of wood smoke. Gray, because that was the color the world had become after his son Samuel drove through the barrier on the Millbrook Bridge, 22 years ago, a lifetime, a blink. At the edge of the forest, a shape moved. Low and fluid, a shadow detaching itself from deeper shadows. Gray emerged. His yellow eyes caught the weak light and held it. Behind him, 4 other wolves materialized among the hemlocks. Eamon clicked his tongue twice and emptied the bucket onto the frozen ground. The pack approached without rush. Gray came up to the stump, close enough for Eamon to feel the heat rising from his pelt. The old man knelt with a grunt and placed his palm on Gray's broad head. The fur was coarse on the surface, but soft underneath like bristles over silk. Gray's tail swung once. That was all. He never whimpered or begged. Theirs was a quiet understanding. The morning stretched on. Eamon stayed on one knee while the pack ate, watching the sky. The wind had shifted during the night, and now it pushed hard from the northeast. The pines above him groaned, a deep wooden sound that vibrated in his chest. He understood the language of trees better than he understood people. This groan meant trouble. A storm was building. He saw it in the way the wolves flattened their ears between mouthfuls, in the nervous flick of their tails. Gray paused to stare toward the ridge, where clouds the color of bruised plums were stacking high. Eamon stood. The cup of coffee had gone cold, forgotten. He should have started the generator, checked the firewood, reinforced the shutters, but his body felt heavy, a weariness deeper than the lack of sleep. He sat down on the porch steps instead and watched Gray finish eating. The wolf looked at him then, directly, and something passed between them. Eamon thought, as he often did, about how the wolf had become the tether holding him to the world. No wife left, no child, just the forest and this animal who demanded nothing but meat and a steady hand, who was keeping him alive. The thoughts circled and dipped into older, darker waters. Samuel. The water under Millbrook Bridge, black and roaring. The phone call that came at 3 in the morning. The way a man's life could splinter so completely that the pieces never fit again, only ground against each other. Eamon rubbed his thumb over the rim of the metal cup. The cold bit his skin. He thought, not for the first time, that some debts can never be paid, only carried. Above him the wind howled, and Gray answered with a low, uneasy whine. Eamon lifted his head to scold the sky or the wolf, or perhaps the memory that clung to him when the pain struck. It came from the base of his skull, a white-hot bolt that exploded behind his right eye. He gasped, and the cup flew from his hand, clattering on the wooden steps. His fingers clawed at the railing, but his right arm would not obey. The world tilted. He heard the coffee splash, the wet sound of it hitting the pine needles. Gray stepped closer, his huge paws silent. The wolf's ears pressed forward, then back. He whimpered, a high, thin note Eamon had never heard before. Eamon tried to speak, tried to call for help that was not there. His tongue was a dead thing in his mouth. The pain spread down his neck, into his shoulder, and his vision began to narrow. The last thing he saw was Gray's yellow eyes, fixed and unblinking. And then the darkness folded over him, heavy as the pines that bent beneath the coming storm. Eamon came back to the world in pieces. Awareness returned like a radio signal breaking through static. First, cold. Cold that pressed up through the floorboards and into his bones. Then, pain. dull now, a pounding rhythm that beat against the back of his skull. He tried to open his eyes and managed only one. The right side of his face lay flat against the wood. His cheek was wet. Blood or saliva, he could not tell. He smelled the iron of it mixing with the old dust and pine resin. He lay in the kitchen. He knew this because he could see the leg of the iron stove and the edge of the rag rug his wife had made 40 years ago, red and brown and fading to gray. He tried to push himself up. The message reached some distant part of his brain, but nothing moved. Not his right arm, not his left, not his legs. A cold terror began to spread from his chest, colder than the floor. He tried to scream. A guttural moan escaped, barely louder than a breath. His lips shaped the word help, but the sound was wrong, a shapeless noise that died in the silence of the empty house. He was trapped. The mind that had run this forest for decades, that knew every deer trail and every fallen oak, was now a prisoner inside a body that would not obey. The helplessness was a physical weight crushing his ribs. He thought of his radio, the old VHF unit mounted on the wall above the table. It might as well have been on the moon. He could see the corner of the table above him, a sheer cliff of pine wood he would never climb. The light in the room shifted. The sun had risen further, or perhaps the clouds had thickened. He could not turn his head to look. The storm was coming. He felt it in the air pressure, in the low ache of his joints that had predicted weather for 50 years. The temperature in the cabin was dropping. He could hear the tick of cooling metal from the stove. By afternoon, the fire would be dead, and the cold would seep in like a slow tide. Gray, the thought of the wolf cut through the fog. Where was Gray? Eamon had fallen on the porch, but now he was inside. He had no memory of being moved. No human hands had touched him, that was certain. The wolf, Gray must have dragged him. But how? The door was still ajar. He could feel the thin draft on his face. And then he remembered the wolf's eyes right before the darkness, and the sound Gray had made a sound unlike any he had heard from the animal. Not the call of a predator, but the cry of a creature losing its anchor. The fear that seized him now was different. It was not the fear of dying alone, though that was present. It was the fear of what the pack might do when the scent of weakness became too strong. He had fed them, yes. He had lived beside them, but they were wolves. And a man who cannot stand is no longer a man to a wolf. He tried to picture Samuel to find some comfort in the memory of his son's face, but the face would not come. Only the guilt came, sharp and clear. A sound broke the silence. A scratching at the door. Eamon's heart lurched. The sound came again, more urgent. A low, keening whine followed it. Gray. He knew the whine now, the same one from the porch. The wolf was trying to get in. His claws scraped against the wooden door that had swung mostly shut. Eamon tried to make a sound, any sound. He forced air through his throat and produced a wet rasp. The scratching stopped. Then a soft huff close to the floor. Gray had pushed his muzzle through the gap. Eamon could hear him sniffing, a rapid, anxious rhythm. A warm breath touched his outstretched hand for just a moment. Then the muzzle withdrew. The scratching did not return. The silence that followed was worse than the scratching. Eamon felt the wolf's absence like a physical cold. Gray had given up. The pack would leave now, seeking better shelter from the storm, and the man on the floor would die alone, as he had always feared he would. Time passed, an hour, maybe more, he could not tell. The light grew dimmer, the cold deepened. Eamon drifted into a half-sleep where dreams and waking merged. He was on the Millbrook Bridge. Samuel was walking ahead, always ahead, and no matter how fast Eamon ran, the distance between them stretched. A sound jerked him back, a long rising howl. It came from just outside the door, so close the walls seemed to vibrate with it. Gray's howl. But it did not end with the usual fading note. It changed. It became a series of short, sharp barks, deliberately spaced. A signal. Eamon had heard wolves call the pack to a kill with that rhythm. He had heard them warn of bears, but this was directed outward away from the cabin. Gray was calling to someone, not to the pack, someone else. The realization came slowly, as if Eamon's mind had to wade through thick mud to reach it. The wolf was trying to bring help. A hope so fierce and painful rose in his chest that he could hardly breathe. He listened to the barking, to the frantic pattern of it, and he understood. Gray would not leave him. Gray would bring someone. The old forest could still surprise him. Or perhaps some debts did get paid after all. Outside, the first heavy drops of rain began to hammer on the roof. The trail vanished somewhere around 3 o'clock. Jake Morrow stopped and stared at the ground, as if he could will the path back into existence. The forest had swallowed it. Ferns and moss covered everything, and the marker he'd scratched onto a birch trunk an hour ago was nowhere to be seen. He turned to the others. Sophie had her camera out, but she wasn't shooting. She was just holding it, her knuckles white. Liam was bent over, hands on his knees, breathing through his mouth. Maya stood apart, scanning the ridges with a flat, clinical gaze. "We should head east," Jake said. "The main road is east. If we keep the setting sun on our left shoulder, we'll hit it before dark." Sophie lowered the camera. "The map said the creek bends north. If we follow the water, we won't go in circles." "That was 2 miles ago. We lost the creek. Because you said the high ground was faster." The words hung in the cold air. Jake's jaw tightened. He had said that, and now the high ground had turned into a maze of identical boulders and fallen hemlocks. Liam straightened up and looked from one to the other like a man watching a tennis match he didn't understand. "Can we just pick a direction? Any direction? It's getting dark." Maya spoke without turning around. "It's 4 hours until full dark. We have time. Panic doesn't help." Liam flinched. Sophie saw it and felt a small mean satisfaction, then immediately hated herself for it. She had come to this trip to escape the apartment in Boston, where every corner held a memory of Claire. Claire's toothbrush in the bathroom. Claire's note on the fridge. Claire leaving. The forest was supposed to be a reboot, a hard reset. Instead, everything felt heavier, the air pressing down like a hand on her chest. They walked again. The ground was soft, the moss spongy underfoot, releasing a wet, earthy smell with every step. The light began to change, moving from weak gold to a flat grayish silver. Sophie noticed the silence first. No birds, no insects, just the sound of their own footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig that she gradually realized wasn't always coming from their group. She stopped and turned, nothing behind them but trees. The forest stared back, indifferent. Liam's voice came out thin. "I need water." Maya handed him her bottle without comment. He drank greedily, and Sophie watched a trickle escape down his chin. She looked away, embarrassed for him. The silence grew thicker. Even the wind had died. The pines stood motionless, like a crowd holding its breath. They pushed through a dense stand of young spruce, needles clawing at their sleeves, and emerged into a small clearing. Sophie saw it before the others, a dark shape on the ground, half hidden by ferns. At first she thought it was a fallen log, but then the smell hit her. Copper and rot, sweet and heavy. Jake moved forward first. "Stay back." He didn't need to say it. No one wanted to get closer. The deer lay on its side, belly torn open, ribs visible like the struts of a broken boat. The ground around it was churned up, mud and leaves thrown in every direction. Fresh tracks crossed the clearing, deep and deliberate. Wolf tracks, too many to count. Sophie had photographed wildlife for 5 years. She knew the difference between a dog's track and a wolf's. These were wolves, big ones. Liam made a choke sound. "We need to go. Right now." "The tracks are fresh," Maya said. "They could still be nearby." "That's exactly why we need to go." Sophie crouched at the edge of the clearing, her camera hanging forgotten. The tracks told a story. The deer had been chased, brought down, cleaned out. What struck her was the efficiency of it. Nothing wasted. She thought about Claire, about the way a relationship could be gutted the same way. Clean and fast, just the bones left. The light shifted again. Jake pointed his small flashlight toward the tree line. The beam trembled, and then Sophie saw it. A wolf stood at the edge of the trees, not 50 feet away. It was huge, pale gray, its coat blending with the dusk. Its head was low, its yellow eyes fixed on them. It did not growl. It did not move. It just watched with a stillness that felt older than the forest itself. Sophie's heart hammered, but she found she couldn't look away. The wolf held her gaze for a long, slow breath. Then it turned and melted back into the darkness between the trunks, as if it had never been there at all. No one spoke. The first stars were coming out, cold and sharp. Somewhere far off, a single howl rose and fell, and then the forest was silent again. The morning came gray and damp. The group had spent the night huddled under a rock overhang, nobody sleeping more than a few minutes at a time. Sophie sat with her back against the cold stone, arms wrapped around her knees, and watched the light creep back into the world. The fear from the night before had settled into something heavier, a dull, constant pressure at the base of her skull. She thought about the wolf, the way it had looked at her, not like a predator sizing up prey, like it was reading something written on her face. Jake was already on his feet, studying the compass. We move as soon as everyone's ready. We need to find high ground again. Maybe get a signal. Maya was checking Liam's ankle, which he had twisted on a root during the panicked flight from the clearing. It's not broken. He can walk, but not fast. Great. Jake's voice was tight. That's just great. Sophie stood and stretched the stiffness from her shoulders. She walked a few paces from the overhang to look down the slope they had climbed in the dark. The forest was thick with mist, the trees half-formed, ghostly, and then she saw it again, the wolf, standing on the same trail they had used, perhaps 100 yards down. It was watching them, head angled slightly, ears pricked forward. As soon as it saw her looking, it took a few steps away, then stopped and looked back. Jake, Sophie's voice was steady. It's back. Everyone turned. Liam scrambled to his feet, ignoring Maya's warning. Oh no, no, it's stalking us. They hunt in packs. It's leading us somewhere. Or it's trying to show us something, Sophie said. Jake stared at her. Show us. It's a wolf, Sophie, not a tour guide. The wolf moved again. It circled a patch of ferns, then backtracked a few yards and repeated the motion. It let out a short, high whine, a sound that didn't belong in the throat of a killer. It looked at them, then away, then back at them. The message was unmistakable, even if it made no sense. It wanted them to follow. A bitter argument erupted. Jake and Maya insisted it was a trap. A sick animal, maybe, or a scout for the pack, luring them deeper into the woods. Sophie held her ground. She had seen something in those eyes. Something that reminded her of a hospital room 6 months ago, of her sister Elena's hand, limp and unresponsive. Elena had stopped speaking weeks before the end. She had just lain there, eyes open, looking at something Sophie couldn't see. Sophie had tried everything to reach her. Gifts, music, old photos, tears, anger. Nothing worked. Elena just drifted further away, and then one morning her bed was empty and the machines were silent. Sophie had stood in the hallway, feeling a helplessness so complete it hollowed her out. She had promised herself she would never feel that helpless again. I'm going, Sophie said. You can stay here or come with me, but I'm following the wolf. Liam looked at her with something between terror and admiration. You're insane. Probably. Maya sighed and shouldered her pack. If you go, we all go. We stay together. That's the rule. Jake looked like he wanted to argue, but the decision had already been made. He shook his head and fell in behind Sophie. They moved down the slope, slipping on wet leaves, the mist swirling around their legs. The wolf kept ahead of them, always visible, never too close. It moved with a deliberate, almost patient rhythm. Stop, look back, wait. Sophie could smell the wet fur now, a musky, wild scent that electrified her nerves. She could hear her own heart, steady but loud, a drumbeat in her ears. They crossed a small stream, the water icy and fast. On the far bank, the wolf stopped at a tangle of blackberry bushes. It nosed at something on the ground, then stepped back. Sophie approached, her throat tight. Lying in the mud was Liam's backpack, the one he had dropped the night before in his panic. The wolf must have found it, but that wasn't what made Sophie's breath catch. Caught in the wolf's teeth had been something else, something the animal had pulled from the pack or found nearby, a flannel cap. Old, faded to a dusty blue with a hand-embroidered letter E on the brim. The stitching was uneven, made by someone who had taken their time. Sophie picked it up. The fabric was cold and damp, but it smelled faintly of wood smoke and coffee. Human smells. Maya came up beside her and stared at the cap. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she whispered, "There's a person out here. The wolf is leading us to a person." No one argued. The wolf had already moved on, standing at the edge of a narrow deer trail that wound deeper into the pines. It looked back at them and whined again, a softer sound this time, almost urgent. Sophie folded the cap carefully and tucked it into her jacket. She looked at the wolf, and for the first time in months, the hollow space inside her chest filled with something that felt like purpose. Time came apart. Eamon did not know if he had been lying on the kitchen floor for hours or days. The light behind his closed eyelids shifted from gray to black and back to gray again. He could not track it. His thoughts drifted like leaves on slow water, bumping into each other and spinning away before he could hold them. The cold had settled deep into his bones now, a permanent ache that flared every time the wind rattled the door. He shivered without moving, a faint tremor that cost him energy he did not have. The fever came next. It started as a warmth spreading from his chest, a false comfort. Then the heat built until his skin burned and the cold floor felt like a relief. He tried to open his mouth to let the heat out, but his jaw was locked tight. His tongue was dry leather. He tasted salt. Tears, maybe, or blood from where he had bitten his cheek in the first seizure. He could not tell anymore. The boundary between insight and outsight had blurred. Gray came back. Eamon knew this because he heard the claws on the porch and the soft huff at the door crack. The wolf pushed his muzzle through the gap and whined, a sound that cut through the fog. Eamon tried to make a sound in return, but nothing came. The wolf stayed for a while, then left. He always left. Eamon did not blame him. A wolf could not turn a doorknob. A wolf could not lift a 74-year-old man onto a bed. A wolf could only witness, and that was a burden no animal should carry. The fever pulled him under. He was no longer on the kitchen floor. He was standing on the Millbrook Bridge, and the river below was black and swollen with spring melt. The railing was broken. Samuel was there, not as the man he would have become, but as the boy he had been. 10 years old, skinny legs, a red cap pulled low over his ears. He was standing at the edge of the broken railing, looking down at the water. "Sam," Eamon called, but his voice was the voice of an old man, thin and cracked. "Come back from there." The boy did not turn. He just leaned forward and Eamon ran, but his legs were made of mud and the bridge stretched longer every second. The distance grew. The water roared, and then Samuel turned his head just a little, and Eamon saw that his eyes were not human. They were yellow. Wolf eyes. "Forgive me," Eamon whispered. The words scraped his throat. "I didn't protect you. I was not there." The boy with the wolf eyes did not answer. He just watched, and Eamon understood that there was no forgiveness to be had. There was only carrying the weight. He had carried it for 22 years. He would carry it into death. The thought, strangely, brought a kind of peace. He stopped running on the bridge and just stood there, and the water below slowed, and the roaring became a low hum. The vision shifted. He was back on the floor, and the fever was breaking. Cold sweat soaked his shirt. His pulse thumped in his ears, a distant drum. He felt emptied out, hollowed like a canoe, but something had changed. The terror that had gripped him since the collapse was looser now. He had faced the boy on the bridge, and he had not broken. Maybe dying was just another bridge to cross. Then a sound split the silence, not the wind, not the house settling. Footsteps. Human footsteps, more than one person, crunching through the wet leaves outside. And Gray's bark, sharp and insistent, right at the door. Eamon's heart surged. He tried to cry out, to move, to do anything. His body betrayed him again. He lay frozen, listening to the footsteps come closer, to the voices that grew louder. "Oh God," a man's voice said, high with shock. "Look at the door. There is blood on the door frame." The footsteps stopped. Eamon heard the creak of the porch boards and the sound of breathing, human and wolf together. He could not see them. He could not call to them. He could only wait, his heart pounding, as the door swung open and cold air rushed in. The wolf led them for 3 hours through country that seemed designed to break the human spirit. The deer trail wound through tight stands of spruce, then dropped into a ravine where the ground turned to black muck that sucked at their boots. Sophie held the flannel cap inside her jacket, her fingers brushing the embroidered E through the fabric. She would not let it go. It was the only proof that the world beyond the trees still held people. Gray moved ahead with a new urgency. His head was low, his tail stiff. Every few minutes he stopped, looked back, and whined until they caught up. The mist had lifted, but the sky remained a flat bruised gray that promised more rain. Jake walked at the rear, his silence heavier than any words. Maya stayed close to him, occasionally glancing back to check on Liam, who stumbled along with his swollen ankle and a face drained of color. "I can't," Liam said suddenly. He stopped in the middle of the trail and sat down on a mossy rock. "I can't walk anymore. Leave me here and send help." Maya turned and walked back to him. She crouched down so her eyes were level with his. "If we leave you here, you'll die of exposure before we find anyone. So stand up." Liam stared at her. There were tears in his eyes, but Maya's face did not soften. She held out her hand. After a long moment, Liam took it and hauled himself upright. They walked on. The terrain grew worse. The ravine opened into a swampy flat where dead trees rose from black water. Gray skirted the edge of the bog, picking a path on firm ground. Sophie watched him and marveled at the animal's certainty. Every step was deliberate. He knew exactly where he was going. She thought about the old cap and the man who must own it. A trapper, maybe a hermit. Someone who had lived out here long enough to earn the trust of a wolf. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it comforted her. If one man could survive out here, so could they. Maya was counting in her head. She had been doing it for the last hour. The temperature was dropping. The light was failing. Liam's ankle was worse, the swelling visible above his boot. She could smell the onset of hypothermia in the way Jake had stopped sweating and started shivering harder. She knew the signs. She had trained for them. But training did not prepare you for the weight of 4 lives in your hands and no equipment beyond a basic first aid kit. She remembered the oath. First, do no harm. But what if doing no harm meant watching someone die because you were too slow? The thought gnawed at her, but she pushed it down and kept walking. Gray stopped at the base of a long, gentle slope. He waited for the group to gather, then turned and padded upward. Sophie saw it first. A roof line half hidden by pines, a chimney with no smoke, a porch with a sagging step. The cabin was old and weathered, the logs gray with age, but it was intact. It was real. There Sophie breathed. There it is. They climbed the slope with the last of their strength. The clearing around the cabin was trampled with wolf tracks, fresh and layered over older ones. On the porch, next to a fallen metal cup, lay the mate to the flannel cap Sophie held. A glove worn and patched. The door stood ajar. A dark smear ran down the wood, reddish, brown, and dry. Jake pushed the door open with his foot. The smell hit them first. Cold air, old wood, and something sharper underneath. Blood and the heavy animal scent of wolf. Jake stepped inside, the others behind him, and then they saw the body. An old man lay on the kitchen floor, motionless, his face gray and his breathing barely visible. One side of his mouth drooped. His eyes were open, fixed on nothing, but they flickered when the light from the door hit them. He was alive. Maya dropped to her knees beside him, her hands moving automatically to check his pulse and airway. "He's had a stroke. Help me roll him onto his side." Sophie knelt to help, but a movement in the far corner of the cabin froze her in place. A second wolf. Smaller than Gray, her coat darker, her belly heavy. She was lying on a pile of old blankets, and her yellow eyes were fixed on Sophie with an intensity that was not aggressive, but was not entirely safe either. Gray padded into the cabin and stood between the female and the humans. He made a low sound in his throat, not a growl but a warning. To the female, not to them. The female flattened her ears and rested her head on her paws, but her eyes never left the strangers. Outside, the first notes of a howl rose from the forest. Another voice joined it, and another, until the air was full of wolf's song. It was not a hunting call. It was something else. A lament, maybe, or a vigil. Sophie held the old man's hand, which was cold and rough as bark, and listened to the wolves sing their strange wild hymn into the coming night. Maya worked with the speed of someone who had trained in rooms full of noise and blood. She checked the old man's pulse again, felt the weakness of it, and pulled back his eyelids. One pupil was larger than the other, fixed and slow to respond. Stroke. Massive, by the look of it. She had no scanner, no drugs except a basic kit with aspirin and bandages. The cabin was freezing. The stove sat cold in the corner. We need to get him off the floor, she said. Heat is the first thing. If his core temperature drops any more, he won't make it. Jake and Sophie lifted Eamon while Maya directed them to a narrow cot in the corner. The mattress was thin, the blankets rough and smelling of old wool. They laid him down and piled every covering they could find on top of him. Sophie tucked the old flannel cap under his head, a small useless kindness that made her throat tight. Liam stood by the door, his weight on his good foot. The wolves are still out there. I can hear them. Everyone could. The howling had stopped, but the sounds that replaced it were worse. Paws on the porch, a low rumbling whine, the occasional scratch at the wood. The female had retreated to a corner near the stove, her yellow eyes tracking every movement. Gray had disappeared outside again, but his presence was a constant pressure against the walls. Jake went to the door and pushed a heavy wooden bar into its brackets. That should hold, but we're not safe in here, not really. Maya looked up from the cot. Safe is not the word I'd use. We have a dying man, no radio signal, and a storm that's about to hit. Safe left the conversation an hour ago. The wind answered her. It slammed against the cabin with a force that made the timbers groan. The windows rattled in their frames. Sophie moved to the stove and opened the iron door. Coals sat dead and gray inside. She found a box of kindling and a stack of split pine on the hearth. Her hands were shaking as she balled up old newspaper and struck a match. The flame caught, small and blue, then orange, and the smell of burning dust filled the room. She fed the fire stick by stick until it was strong enough to take a log. The heat began to push back against the cold. The moral question hung in the air, unspoken but heavy. Should they stay? Could they leave? Maya thought about the path they had taken. The swamp, the deadfall, the temperature dropping outside. If they tried to carry the old man, he would die on the trail. If they left him and went for help, he would die alone. If they all stayed and the storm trapped them, they might all die together. There was no good answer, only a choice between different kinds of failure. Sophie sat on the floor beside the cot and looked at the old man's face, the deep lines around his mouth, the sunken cheeks, the gray stubble. He looked like her father in the last weeks before the cancer took him, thin and silent and far away. Her father had died in a hospital room with machines and bright lights and strangers coming and going. But he had died alone anyway. Sophie had been stuck in traffic when the call came. She had promised to be there, and she had broken that promise. Looking at this stranger, she felt the weight of that memory settle on her shoulders. She would not break another promise. We stay, she said. We keep him warm, and we wait out the storm. When it clears, 2 of us go for help. Jake opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. Maya nodded once. Liam said nothing, his face pale and wet with sweat. It was Maya who found the journals. She was searching for more blankets in an old trunk at the foot of the cot when her fingers touched leather. She pulled out a stack of notebooks, their covers worn and stained. On the top one, in careful letters that must have taken the old man a long time to write, were the words, "Gray is my only friend. If you are reading this, I was not wrong." She opened it and the story began to unfold. Pages of cramped handwriting, some smeared with water or tears. Dates that went back years. A name, Samuel, the bridge, the wolf pup in the trap, the slow patient building of trust. Maya read a few lines aloud, and the others gathered close, the firelight dancing on their faces. The storm outside built to a fury, the wind screaming through the pines, and then came a crack so loud it seemed to shake the earth. A tree, ancient and heavy, had snapped somewhere nearby. The cabin trembled. When the echo faded, Sophie walked to the window and looked out. The deer trail they had followed was gone, buried under a tangle of fresh timber. They were cut off. The forest had closed its fist. The storm trapped them inside the cabin for the whole night. The wind howled and the windows shook, and the wolves outside kept their vigil, dark shapes that moved at the edge of the firelight. Inside, the group huddled around the kerosene lamp and the journals. One by one, they passed the notebooks and read the story of Eamon Keegan. Jake read about the night Samuel died, the phone call, the drive to the river, the days after when Eamon could not eat or sleep, when his wife's grief was a wall he could not climb. The cabin in the woods became a refuge and a prison. He had come here to disappear. Jake thought about his own father, a man he had not called in 3 years, because the silence between them had grown too wide. He wondered now if that silence was a choice or just a habit that had hardened into a cage. Sophie read about the wolf pup. Eamon had found it on a cold January morning, its leg caught in a rusted trap, its body so thin the ribs showed through the fur. He had freed it and carried it home and fed it scraps of meat, expecting it to die. It did not die. It grew strong and wary and eventually brought others. A pack had formed around this one man's solitude. Sophie traced the words with her finger. She thought about her sister, Elena, how she had tried to feed or hope in those last months. Sometimes hope was just scraps of meat offered to a wounded thing. You never knew if it would be enough. The medical crisis came without warning. One moment Maya was listening to the wind. The next she heard a change in Eamon's breathing. She moved to the cot and pressed her fingers to his wrist. His pulse was jumping, erratic, a fish flopping in a boat. Arrhythmia. The old heart was struggling. She dug through the first aid kit and found nothing that would help. Her training screamed for a defibrillator, for drugs she did not have. She could only sit and watch and hope. Liam cracked. He had been silent for hours, pressed into a corner with his swollen ankle propped on a sack. Suddenly he pushed himself up, his face twisted. "This is her fault," he said, pointing at Sophie. "She made us follow a wild animal into the woods, and now we're trapped here with a dying man and a pack of wolves outside. We're going to die because of her." Sophie took the blow without flinching. She had expected it. Part of her even believed it. The guilt was already there, waiting for a voice to give it shape. Jake stepped between them. "That's enough. We're all here. We all made the choice. Blaming each other won't keep us warm." Liam slumped back, his anger spent as quickly as it had come. He covered his face with his hands. Outside, the wind shifted key, and the wolves answered with a long, mournful chord. The kerosene lamp flickered. Shadows danced on the log walls. The smell of the old man's sickness mixed with the scent of burning pine and the faint sweet trace of some herb Maya had found in the trunk, something like dried lavender or old incense. Sometime after midnight, Eamon's eyes opened. They were cloudy, unfocused, but they moved across the room until they found Sophie. He looked at her for a long moment, and then his cracked lips shaped a word. No sound came, but Sophie read it, him. She leaned closer. "What?" Eamon's gaze shifted to the door. His lips moved again, and this time a whisper came, so faint it was almost lost in the noise of the storm. "Let him in." Sophie looked at Jake. Jake looked at the barred door, at the wolves beyond it. Every instinct told him to keep it shut, but the old man's eyes were pleading, and something in those journals had worked its way into his chest, a splinter he could not ignore. He lifted the bar and pulled the door open just enough for a gray shape to slip through. Gray entered without hesitation. He padded across the floor and lay down at the foot of the cot, his massive head resting on his paws. The female in the corner whined, but did not move. The tension in the room shifted from terror to something else, something quieter. Eamon's hand twitched on the blanket, and Gray pushed his nose against it. The old man's breathing, ragged and uneven, began to slow. Maya watched the rhythm of it, the rise and fall of the chest, and saw that it was falling into sync with the wolf's steady breath. The two of them, man and animal, breathed together. The storm screamed on, but inside the cabin, a small strange peace had settled. The storm died an hour before dawn. The wind, which had screamed for so long that the sound had become a kind of silence, suddenly dropped to nothing. The cabin creaked once, twice, and then settled. The quiet that followed was deeper than any quiet Sophie had ever known. It pressed against her ears. It made her own breathing sound loud. The fire had burned low. Jake rose from his spot by the hearth and added 2 logs, working quietly so as not to wake the others. But no one was really sleeping. Liam lay on his back, staring at the ceiling. Maya sat cross-legged beside the cot, her fingers resting on Eamon's wrist, counting the pulse that still jumped and stuttered. Sophie leaned against the wall near the door, watching Gray. The wolf had not moved from the foot of the cot all night. Gray lifted his head, his ears pricked forward. A moment later, the female rose from her corner and padded to the door. She made a low sound, not quite a whine, and looked back at Gray. The big wolf did not move, but his tail thumped once against the floorboards. The female pushed her nose against the door, and Jake, after a hesitation, lifted the bar and let her out. Cold air flooded the room, and with it came the smell of wet earth and broken pine. The female disappeared into the gray light. She returned 20 minutes later. Jake had left the door cracked, and she pushed it open with her shoulder. In her jaws, she carried a snowshoe hare, still limp, its white fur streaked with blood. She crossed the room and laid it at the foot of the cot, then stepped back and sat down, her yellow eyes moving from face to face. Waiting. Liam pushed himself up on his elbows. Is she feeding us? Maya looked at the hare, then at the female, then at Eamon. I think she's paying a debt. The hare lay on the rough floorboards, a gift that crossed the line between animal and human, between wild and tame. Sophie felt tears press against the back of her eyes. She blinked them away. The gesture was so simple and so strange that it broke something open inside her. She thought about all the gifts she had been given in her life and all the ones she had refused. Love that she had pushed away because it was easier to be alone. Help that she had rejected because she did not want to owe anyone. And here was a wolf, a creature that owed nothing to anyone, offering food to strangers because they had helped her pack. Liam started to cry. It was not the loud heaving sobs of a breakdown. It was a quiet, hopeless sound. I can't accept this, he whispered. I can't take food from a wolf. It's not right. None of this is right. Maya moved to him and put her hand on his back. Right doesn't matter right now. Survival matters. Take the gift, eat something, keep your strength. Liam shook his head and turned his face to the wall. Maya didn't push. She picked up the hare and carried it to the hearth. Sophie watched her work, the knife moving with practiced efficiency, the meat divided into portions. The smell of roasting flesh filled the cabin, and Sophie's stomach clenched with a hunger she had been ignoring for hours. Jake knelt beside Sophie by the door. His face was drawn, the stubble on his jaw dark against pale skin. When the sun is fully up, I'm going for help. 2 of us should go. Maya stays with Eamon. You or Liam come with me. Liam can barely walk. Then it's you. Sophie nodded. The decision felt heavy, but also clean. There was no argument left in her. The night had burned away everything except the need to act. Eamon drifted in and out of consciousness. The fever had broken, but his body was a ruined house. He could feel Gray's warmth at his feet, a solid weight that anchored him. He heard the voices around him, the soft words, the footsteps, and he understood that strangers were caring for him. The gift of the hare reached him through the fog. He wanted to weep, but his body had no water left for tears. Instead, he lay still and let the gratitude fill the hollow spaces. The wolf had paid his debt. Now Eamon could pay his own. He closed his eyes and saw Samuel again, not on the bridge this time, just standing in a field of sunlit grass, a red cap on his head, waving. The image was a gift, too, and he held it gently, afraid it would break. For 22 years, every memory of his son had been wrapped in guilt. This one was different. This one was just his boy, waving, happy. Eamon did not know if it was real or a trick of his dying brain. He did not care. He took the image and held on. The first light of dawn slipped through the windows, pale and cold. Sophie and Jake packed a small bag with water, the remains of a granola bar, and a flashlight. Gray watched them, his head still resting on his paws. As Sophie reached for the door, the wolf stood. He did not block her way. He just stood there, his yellow eyes meeting hers. Then he turned and lay back down beside Eamon. The message was clear. His place was here. The humans would have to find their own way. They stepped outside into a world remade by the storm. Trees lay across the path like fallen giants, their roots torn from the earth. Branches and needles carpeted the ground. The air was sharp and clean and silent. Sophie took 3 steps and then stopped. A sound was building in the distance, a low thrum, mechanical and steady. Jake heard it too. He grabbed her arm and pointed at the sky. A helicopter was coming over the ridge, its rotors chopping the cold morning air. Maya burst from the cabin. She waved her jacket over her head, screaming words that were swallowed by the growing thunder of the blades. The helicopter banked and hovered, the downdraft whipping the pines. A man in an orange vest leaned out and gave them a thumbs up. Sophie felt her legs go weak. She sat down hard on the wet ground and laughed, a raw broken sound that turned into something else. Around her, the wolves had vanished. The clearing was empty except for the humans. Inside the cabin, Eamon heard the rotors and let go of the image of his son. He was not afraid anymore. He was not alone. Somewhere beyond the cabin walls, Gray lifted his head and howled once, a note that cut through the mechanical roar. A farewell, a promise. The old man's lips moved, shaping words that no one could hear. Thank you, thank you. 3 months passed before Eamon saw the cabin again. The hospital in Bangor had kept him for 2 weeks, running tests and adjusting medications. Then a rehabilitation center in Augusta, where he learned to walk with a cane and to speak again in short, careful sentences. The left side of his face still drooped, and his right hand had a tremor that would not go away. The doctors talked about progress and goals, but Eamon measured recovery differently. He measured it by how many times a day he thought about Samuel. The number had gone down, not because he missed his son less, but because the memories no longer cut the way they used to. The wound had grown scar tissue. It was still there. It would always be there, but it no longer bled. Sophie had visited him twice in the hospital. The first time, she brought a printed photograph of Gray, taken the morning after the storm, just before he vanished into the trees. Eamon had held the photo with his good hand and stared at it for a long time. The second time, she brought a proposal. She wanted to document his return to the cabin. A short film, or maybe a series of photographs. Something that told the story of what had happened in those woods. Eamon had said yes before she finished her sentence, not because he wanted fame. Fame was a city thing. He said yes because he wanted someone to witness the quiet part, the part after the crisis, the part where a man learned to live again. The Forest Service had repaired the worst of the storm damage. The deer trail was clear, though still rough. Sophie drove the rental truck as far as the old logging road would allow, then they walked the last mile through the pines. Eamon moved slowly, his cane sinking into the soft ground. The air was different now. Spring had arrived while he was away. The snow was gone, replaced by mud and the first green shoots pushing through the dead leaves. The smell was different too, wet and alive, full of growing things. The cabin came into view and Eamon stopped walking. The porch had been repaired. The door stood straight. Someone, probably one of the rangers, had patched the roof and cleaned the debris from the yard. It should have looked like home. Instead, it looked like a museum, a place where something important had happened and then ended. He felt a coldness in his chest that had nothing to do with the spring air. They might not come back, Sophie said quietly. It's been 3 months. Wolves move on. Eamon nodded. He had thought about this possibility every day since the helicopter lifted him out of the clearing. The forest had its own logic. Gray had stayed because Eamon was there, but Eamon had left. The scent would have faded. The territory would have shifted. Wolves did not keep promises the way humans did, or maybe they kept them differently. They spent the afternoon cleaning the cabin. Sophie swept the floor while Eamon sat on the porch and watched the tree line. The sun moved across the sky, shadows lengthened. Birds called. A squirrel chattered from a nearby pine. The normal sounds of the forest returned, and they felt wrong, too loud, too careless. as if the woods had forgotten what had happened here. Sophie came out with 2 cups of coffee. She sat beside Eamon on the steps and handed him one. Jake called me last week. He's finally talking to his father again. Said the first conversation was the hardest thing he's ever done. Eamon took a sip. The coffee was hot and bitter, and Liam started therapy. Maya checked in on him. He's doing better. Slowly. Sophie paused. I went to see my sister's grave. Elena, I hadn't been since the funeral. I talked to her, or at her. It felt stupid and necessary at the same time. Eamon looked at her. The lines around his mouth deepened. Not stupid. Necessary is enough. They sat in silence as the sun dropped lower. The coffee cooled. The shadows stretched across the clearing, and then Eamon saw something at the edge of the pines. A gray shape, barely visible against the dusk. His heart lurched. The cup trembled in his hand. Sophie saw it too. She set her cup down, slowly, as if any sudden movement might break a spell. Gray stepped out of the trees. He was thinner than before, the ribs visible beneath the thick fur. He moved with a slight limp favoring his left front leg. The winter had been hard. It had left its marks, but his yellow eyes were the same, bright and steady, and they were fixed on Eamon. Eamon pushed himself upright with the cane. He took one step, then another, crossing the clearing. Gray did not move. He just waited, his tail low, his ears forward. When Eamon was close enough, he lowered himself onto a fallen log and sat. The wolf approached and laid his head on the old man's knee. A low whine escaped his throat. Eamon placed his trembling hand on Gray's head, feeling the coarse fur, the warmth beneath. From the edge of the clearing, Sophie raised her camera. She did not press the shutter. Some moments were too heavy for photographs. Instead, she just watched as the light faded and the old man and the wolf sat together in the gathering dusk. A breeze moved through the pines and the trees whispered. They had not forgotten. They would never forget. Behind Gray, at the edge of the trees, another shape appeared. The female, and behind her, 3 small shadows, puppies. They tumbled over each other, clumsy and curious, their ears too big for their heads. One of them, the boldest, crept forward and sniffed at Eamon's boot. Gray did not stop him. The old man laughed, a soft broken sound, and the tears came. He let them fall. "Welcome home, old friend," he whispered. The pines remembered. The debt was paid, and somewhere beyond the ridge, a story continued, one that would never be written down, but would be told in the language of fur and breath, and the quiet love between 2 damaged creatures who had saved each other twice.